Welcome back to the swamp, my friends. Today we are going to be reading some creepy and allegedly true stories from the middle of nowhere, sent in by viewers just like you. I know, it's been a very long time since I've done one of these, and I do apologize for that. I got caught up with all the nature stuff. But it's time to get back into some creepy stories from the middle of nowhere. If you have a story that you would like to share in a future video, be sure to submit it at swampdweller.net or the email you can find in the description down below. I'd love to share your story with everyone here in the swamp. It's stories like yours that help keep this channel going. Now, let's get into these creepy, allegedly true stories that'll keep you up tonight. This is a recounting of a terrifying incident that 3 of my friends experienced during the summer after our junior year in high school. I very nearly became a part of the tale myself, but a scheduled shift at the movie theater saved me. They showed up at my house earlier that day asking if I wanted to go with them into the woods to explore an area we had yet to search, but I had to work later that evening, so I had to decline. It's been over 25 years since this occurred, therefore not all that happened can be remembered, but I will do my best. Looking back now at the way life was then, I can positively say things have changed greatly for kids. My neighborhood was its own self-contained city on the edge of the city limits. At the end of the 60s, some idealistic developers got the crazy idea to buy up hundreds of rolling acres of prairie and forest, just out in the middle of nowhere, and create a little suburban sprawl for the coming rise of manufacturing and the people who needed to fill those jobs. The factories did come, Johnson & Johnson, Folger's Coffee, places such as that, but within 30 years they would begin to leave just as quickly. The children of these factory workers found themselves separated from their peers in the rest of the city, and with nothing better to do than to explore the woods around them and discover nature much as their distant ancestors who settled this land would have, I was one of these children, and so were my 3 friends, who would make the discovery on one of these journeys into the woods. Without me along, they took to the fields opposite the new highway. These stretched for miles back then, and during this summer were laying fallow. Our part of Texas rides the line between prairie land and riparian forest. You may find yourself walking for miles on open land only to discover acres upon acres of woods between the next field. After walking for miles across nothing, they came upon a forested area most of us had yet to explore. A path led to an abandoned barn. When they turned the corner to look inside of it, they came face to face with the corpse of a hanged man. From what I was told later, not one of them believed it to be real. However, as they got closer, there was no longer any doubt. The body was that of a trucker who had parked his 18-wheeler at the nearby truck stop around Christmas. He walked the 3 or so miles into the woods and ended his life. To this day, no one knows if he knew that barn was there or he just happened upon it. But we do know on that hot, humid summer day, his bloated body posed a horrific sight to them. Realizing someone was likely missing him, my friend returned to the very same truck stop he had walked away from a year before and called the cops. Of course, I didn't hear about all this stuff until the next day. Even though it did sound like an amazing adventure, I'm thankful I had to sit it out. All 3 of them went on to different levels of legal and emotional troubles, including battles with drug addiction. The only one left living, Steven, has spent several stints in and out of institutions, and the last time we spoke, little of my childhood friend remained. I can't claim that the discovery of the trucker's body was the only reason for their eventual decline, but it most certainly contributed to it. The railroad tracks in my area were all ripped up sometime during the Great Depression, due to the economic hardships as well as the fact that the rail line really wasn't necessary anymore, as trucks were handling most of the shipments from the port by this point. The old route from the port along the shoreline and through the two neighboring towns is actually still there, and the county has turned it into a walking and cycling trail. Many people who work in one town but live in the other two usually just use this trail to commute by bike during the summer months, and many more people like myself use it for recreational purposes. Over the years, several side trails have been built off the main route to better connect certain areas of the towns and make the whole area more accessible by bike. The areas in between the towns where the trail just runs through fields and woods parallel with the highway have remained relatively unchanged. However, since there really isn't anything of interest to connect the trails out there, this is why I found it rather odd that one summer evening when I was out there riding my bike, I noticed what appeared to be a half-finished trail branching off from one of the main trails in a heavily forested area between two of the towns. I couldn't ride my bike in, as they hadn't laid down gravel or anything yet, so the ground was very rough, but the trees had been cut back to allow you to pass through. I locked my bike next to a tree on the main trail and began to walk down this new section to see where it went. I figured maybe they were adding another new trail to access the beach or something, as it did head towards the water. The trail curved a few times and began to get narrower before finally opening into a massive clearing, and that's where the red flag started to go up. The entire clearing was covered with bricks. Not like they were just placed on the ground either. This looked like a professional landscaping job, and very much resembled the brick driveways that very wealthy people tend to have. Even stranger was the large boulder in the center of this brick circle. It was cut perfectly flat across the top and about waist height, and polished to an almost mirror-like shine. As I looked around, I noticed that all around the outside of the circle, there were more boulders spaced evenly about 2 feet apart, forming a kind of perimeter around the site. I also noticed that the bricks that covered the ground were different colors and seemed to be forming some sort of pattern that originated from the boulder in the center of the circle. By this point, the sun was beginning to go down, and because I was in the woods, it was getting dark fast, so I decided I should probably head home. Besides, this place seemed really creepy. I got back on my bike and turned on the little battery-powered lights and began riding toward my hometown. As I thought about it more, I realized how odd it was that the circle even existed. The trail I had walked into was far too narrow for the machinery required to even get through. You would have needed at least a medium-sized excavator with a hydraulic thumb on the bucket, and there was no way that machine could even get through a trail that narrow. Furthermore, the crawler tracks on the excavator would have torn up the trail pretty bad, leaving some kind of mark. They also would have had to drive the machine in along the main trail for about 10 kilometers from where it met up with the road, so someone definitely would have noticed. I returned to the circle a few days later in the afternoon when I had more time to poke around. The pattern laid out in the bricks turned out to be some kind of spiral maze, like you'd find on the back of a kid's menu. I actually tried walking the maze and it proved to be quite difficult, but I did eventually solve it. What struck me as odd though was the starting point of the maze didn't line up with the access trail at all. It just pointed off into the woods toward the water. Also, with the increased daylight, I could also see that the boulders in and around the circle weren't just any old rocks. They were polished black granite, like they make tombstones out of. The whole place gives off a very cult sacrifice altar type vibe, especially with that big flat rock in the middle. This is the part of the story where you probably expect me to start talking about how I saw a black hooded figure standing in the trees or some really weird stuff, but truthfully, nothing really happened outside of this discovery. The one really creepy part about this place is no one has any idea who built it, how they built it, or why. The county did eventually discover it after some people like me investigated it, and they don't know why it's there either. The narrow access trail was eventually expanded and connected to the maze entrance, and now there is a plaque at the entrance that was put there by the county. It talks about the mystery behind this place, and it's been officially named the Labyrinth after the maze pattern on the ground. The county now maintains it as part of the trail, but to this day the mystery of how this place came into existence has never been solved. This story happened around 2001 or 2002. An incident that had been long forgotten, but after listening to your channel on the daily, it brought back some memories and made me realize how weird and dangerous the situation could have been. At the time, I lived in southern Ohio in a small town. We lived about 45 minutes outside of town in the middle of nowhere, where seeing people on the roads or in the area was extremely rare. We had one neighbor about a quarter-mile down the road to the right, and then a large Amish family who lived a few miles in the opposite direction. At the time, I was around 12 years old. I was outside in my football gear taking the dog out to the bathroom and messing around in my yard, practicing for my game later that morning. Now, to describe the area more to help understand things better, we lived on a large farmland we rented that sat on about 150 acres. On the road heading the direction of which would eventually lead you to the Amish family home was going up a small hill, and about 100 yards the direction, the road made a large sharp turn into a heavily wooded area where you could not see the road or anything other than trees. With being such an empty area, you couldn't see much, but it was so quiet you could hear cars coming well before you actually saw them. This is a short story, but the details I'm giving are to help explain why this situation bothers me so much. So please bear with me. As I'm outside, I look up the road to see a man hobbling down the road in our direction. He sees me and waves. I yell for my mom as it's just me and her at the time, and it was rare to see someone walking so far out in the middle of nowhere. As he gets closer, I can see he seems to be in pain, and his clothes are rather worn and ripped up. Mom comes outside just about the time he gets to the house. He begins saying he was just in an accident around the turn and needs help. He asks to come in the house to use the phone and sit. Mom says she will grab the phone and he can sit on the chair on the porch and rest. He asks again to come inside and tries to reassure her there will be no problems. He's just in a lot of pain and wants to rest. Mom gets a look on her face and says he cannot come into the house. She is not comfortable with that and that he can stay on the porch while she fetches the phone. He reluctantly does, and my mom shoots a glance that I took as keep an eye on him. At this time, I was pretty young, but I had hit a growth spurt early in life, and with me only being 12-ish at the time, I was already roughly 6'1", pushing 300 pounds. And this man was 5'10", if he was lucky, and rather skinny. Though his clothes are torn and raggedy, it does not look like he was in an accident. There also was no blood, no cuts, not a single mark anywhere on his body. He starts to ask if anyone was home, as he's looking into our door kinda peeking around and looks around the area. I say no, but my dad should be home soon. My mom comes back out and tells him the cordless phone is dead and that she will use the old rotary phone Dad refused to get rid of. She asks if he would like her to call 911 or any of his family for help. The man stands up and says he'll just come in and make the call to his friend to tow his car. He starts walking toward the door. My mom says no, he is not welcome to come in. He then asks if he could come in and use the bathroom, and he really just needs to pee. Again, Mom says no, and he's welcome to walk across the street and pee in the bushes. He then asks to come in and grab a glass of water. Mom says she will grab it and then he needs to sit back down. With a huff of frustration, the man does and my mom goes to grab him water. When she comes back with the glass of water, she also has my dad's shotgun in hand. She places it by the door on the inside of the house, not trying to hide it at all. The man sees this and I watch his eyes become wide and he starts to become very fidgety. She comes out to hand him the glass and he asks if she can make a call for him. The man stands up and says he will be fine and not to worry. He'll figure it out and walks away in the direction he came from. My mom watches and asks me a few questions. She says he was making her feel very, very uncomfortable. I didn't really understand what was going on and was worried that the man was not going to be okay. He said he had flipped his car and it had come to a stop against the trees. My mom said something was off and asked if I heard anything before he showed up. I said I didn't hear anything and that things were silent as they always were. I had never even heard a car coming. She stares for a few seconds and tells me to stay outside for a little longer and keep an eye out until Dad gets home, which would be any minute. She said if the man comes back that she's leaving the shotgun by the door, and if I see him, I'm to grab it and yell for her. I ain't confused at this point, but tell her I will, and she goes inside. I watch as the man goes around the turn, disappearing. About a minute later, Dad comes home around that same turn. I go to see him and ask him if he saw the guy and tell him what happened. I only got a couple of words in before my mom comes out and starts to explain it all. After she was done, he asked what direction he walked in. She tells him which way, and he gets a confused look on his face. My mom asks, "What is it?" And my dad begins to say he just came from that area, and there was no man or no vehicle anywhere in that direction. Nothing at all. It was all normal as usual, and definitely no signs of a rollover accident, and no man walking the road. My mom gets a worried look on her face and they go inside, and that was the end of the situation for me. I have no idea what they talked about inside. I don't know if they called anyone or anything. I almost immediately forgot about it all as I was excited about my football and was ready to get going. I am almost 30 now, and I've never thought about this until a couple of weeks ago when hearing a story on your show which triggered the memory. I asked Dad if he remembers, but of course he doesn't really. He has a terrible memory, and it wasn't a situation he was really a part of, I guess. My mom passed a few years ago, so I don't have the chance to talk with her about it. But thinking about it now, I can't help but wonder what was really going on. A bit of backstory before I begin. This happened in 2007 in upstate New York on Christmas night, around 8:30 p.m. The day was pleasant and festive, opening presents early in the morning with my sisters, hearty breakfast made by Dad, delicious smells from the kitchen as Mom and Dad prepared a feast, visits from extended family bringing pies and cakes for dessert. Around 2, we all sat down to eat, and then lazed about for the rest of the afternoon into the evening. At about 8, after everyone had left and the food was all put away for round 2 the following day, I decided to head over to visit my friend in the next village. The drive would be about 10 minutes if I took the back roads to get there, so I did. First, a little background on where my friend lived. It was a housing development surrounding a private lake. You might call it a gated community. You could still drive through it freely after hours by entering one of 4 private entry points. Since the community was built around the lake, the road surrounding it went in a spiral sort of shape. The houses were sparsely positioned on the outermost part of the spiral road, closest to the 4 private entry points. As you drove in further, there were a lot more houses positioned closer together nearer the lake. My friend lived on the outer edge of this development, so once I reached the entry point, it would only take me another few minutes until I reached the house. His house, along with all the others, were far enough apart that you couldn't see them from the road as you were driving by. There were woods on either side of them, with long driveways and open fields. You could see porch lights in the distance, but that was about it. As I entered into the development, the speed limit dropped from 30 miles per hour down to 20. There were no streetlights in the development, and for some reason, I never put my high beams on. I couldn't go any faster than the speed limit because there were speed bumps in every 30 feet or so. It was a mild night. I remember having my driver's side window open slightly, taking in some fresh air.
I remember driving in silence, which was unusual for me. I normally always listen to music when driving. I must have been enjoying the quietness after the commotion of the day. I reached a section of the road that had barren fields on either side and wood set to the back. Houses were probably nestled back into the trees. As I drove, I noticed what looked like someone walking up ahead on the opposite side of the road, coming in my direction. Mind you, I was still going about 20 miles per hour the whole time, so it was probably less than a minute by the time the walker came into clear view. I got a quick scan of it from my windshield before my car, and it was exactly parallel. This is what I saw. It was not a person. It stood on two long legs, with long arms hanging down from its shoulders. It was strong-looking, lean, muscular, but not beefy in stature. It looked thin at the same time. It stood at least 7 feet tall. It was light-colored. I'm not sure whether it was white, tan, yellow, or grayish. It didn't appear to have fur, but there was some texture to the skin. It wasn't smooth. There appeared to be something coming down off of its back. I don't know what it was. All I can recall about its face is the small features it had, but the mouth and jaw were notably large. It had pointed things atop its head. Two things going straight upward with something mingled between the two things. That's what I got from a quick scan, and from my observation of it, as it neared my car and as my car neared it. As my car became parallel to it within a split second, I went from looking out my windshield to looking at it from my driver's side window. At that moment, its face quickly peered down at me, and all I remember was the mouth open wide. Out came a remarkable scream that I'll never forget. It gives me chills just thinking about it. It consisted of a high-pitched shrill shriek, enveloped by a deep guttural growl. Both sounds happened simultaneously in that scream. I kept driving all the while. This was all happening so fast that I didn't even have a chance to be scared or shocked or anything. I continued driving and continued past my friend's house and drove home. I called him to tell him what happened, and I just needed to get back. I was probably running on adrenaline to get home. Later on, I was in total shock after it sunk in. Had my driver's side window been opened fully, it would have touched me, or worse, taken me. I'm certain of it. To this day, I still haven't worked out what this was. Has anyone else ever seen anything like this?
My name is Rob. For the past few years, I've held the position of Deputy Team Leader at the Brecon Mountain Rescue Team here in Wales. The BMRT is an essential emergency service in rural Wales, staffed entirely by volunteers and funded entirely by donations from the National Lottery and members of the public. Our work is not just restricted to mountain or wilderness search and rescue for climbers and hill walkers. Our skills are also deployed by the Welsh Police to search for vulnerable or missing persons on assignments where we can employ our specialist medical and rescue techniques. I've seen some pretty wild things during my time in the rescue team, some of which may be more distressing or disturbing than others, some more than I'd care to admit. But there's only been one incident in my entire career that myself or my colleagues have not been able to fully explain. This is the story of that incident. Mountain rescue teams can only be called on the authority of the police. A call is normally initiated by the local force in response to a 999 call or the report of a missing person. The team can be, and is usually called out at any time of day or night, under any conditions, even on New Year's Day and Christmas Day. The relevant police personnel will initially alert the rescue team by means of a pager message. A little outdated, I know, but it reflects the slimmer than slim budget we're forced to work with year in, year out. Once the volunteers receive their "I will respond" message, the ball gets rolling. A team leader, or deputy team leader will then discuss the details of the incident with the coordinating police officers and decide an appropriate rendezvous point and if any additional assets need to be deployed. These can include additional teams, tracker dogs, or even helicopter support if the situation calls for one to be deployed. So I'm sitting in the Drover's Arms pub with a few mates, having just finished watching one of their younger brothers represent their high school in a rugby sevens match. Their team won. So, spirits are high. We've just finished some dinner, and I'm about to get stuck into my first pint of the evening when my beeper goes off. I won't lie, I was a bit annoyed. I'd really been looking forward to that pint, but we're explicitly told to expect things like that. Such is life of a mountain rescue volunteer. Anyway, I let the lads know I had to leave, put my coat on, and began to take the 10-minute walk up to the small set of offices that serve as the BMRT headquarters. It's early on a Sunday night. Most calls seem to happen around holidays and weekends, and the place is empty. So I unlock the doors to turn on all the lights, and walk down to my office to phone the police liaisons officer to get all the necessary details. As I'm talking to the officer in question, my phone starts lighting up with text messages from various other team members, telling me they're on their way. Everything was coming together nicely, and the situation seemed to be like usual. Basic search and rescue job. A couple of hikers went up into the hills on Saturday, intending to camp overnight before heading back down on Sunday afternoon. According to the person who had called it in, the hikers hadn't returned on schedule, nor were they answering any of their phones. So they called us. Now, on more than one occasion we've gotten calls from members of the public reporting missing people who weren't actually missing at all. Sometimes, groups are slowed down by dodgy ankles, or an upset tummy, or, something like that. I get why someone might panic, and it's always better to be safe than sorry. That's why the BMRT exists in the first place. So it's always helps when the person making the call knows a little bit about the missing person's group. Especially if they know the intended route, so we can retrace or follow it to the best of our, ability. That'll help us potentially find them nice and quickly too. If we can focus our search, we don't need helicopter support, which saves us a huge amount of money. I know that sounds callous, but we really do live and die on our funding, so it's essential we keep the purse strings tight. So, I'm going through all the core details with the liaison officer, determining where the group most likely started their trek. Determining the group's most likely whereabouts, trying to figure out where they started and where they could have gotten lost. We go through all the usual stuff, just like normal, then move on to the miscellaneous details that can often aid a search. These can include any medical conditions that might bring the persons into difficulty, age ranges, and things of that nature. You'd be amazed how tiny, seemingly insignificant details can help with a search. So it's extremely important that we compile as much information as possible, as quickly as possible. Only when I pressed the liaison officer for more information regarding the emergency call itself, she became awful cagey. Very little in the way of detailed information could be passed along regarding the missing group. The only significant detail is that the woman who had reported them missing was absolutely distraught when she did so. The dispatcher had noted that no matter what she did or said, she could not seem to reassure the caller that their loved ones would be found. The caller seemed convinced that the group of hikers was gone and never coming back. Honestly, it's stuff like this that kept me in the BMRT for so long. Being the hero that people so desperately need at what for many is the lowest point of their lives thus far. Less than an hour after the initial beeper messages, myself and 4 additional volunteers had converged at the BMRT HQ, ready to begin our search. Our route would take us over 16 miles of hills and mountains, roughly 5 hours of solid walking. But it was likely we'd find the missing group of hikers in a fraction of that time. At least that's what we told ourselves initially. We did find something relatively quickly. After only 45 minutes worth of hiking up gently sloping trails, but it didn't fill us with confidence. In fact, it did the very opposite. We found a tent, an empty, abandoned tent. Being a BMRT volunteer sometimes means you're basically a detective. You can use small pieces of a puzzle to build up a larger picture of an overall situation. What we had before us was an empty 2-man tent, but we were looking for a total of 4 missing hikers. What was clear was that whoever had set this tent up had been easily able to make it down into the Brecon to report an emergency. Only, they hadn't. They had apparently gone back up the trail. But why would they do such a thing? This escaped us completely. This was the first really worrying sign as well. But what was obvious is that they had done so without even wearing their hiking boots. So they had climbed up the mountain barefoot in the middle of the night. That's definitely not good. This happened to be in the middle of March, not the coldest month of the year, but one which brings strong winds to central Wales. Wind chill can lower ambient temperatures by almost half, and tend to be the cause of most cases of hypothermia we encounter. A hiker can look outside, see a sunny day, and assume fine weather. But once they're up a mountain, the wind can drop the temperature into a single digit, and turn seemingly benign situations into a deadly one. But it wasn't just hiking boots that had been left behind either. A fair amount of cold weather clothing had been left behind in the tent, along with what appeared to be a significant amount of food and water. It was at that point that any hope of getting through this rescue without having to call in a helicopter support went right out the window. Whoever was lost out here needed help, and quickly. So we called it in, and within a few minutes, a search and rescue helicopter had taken off from Neville Hall Hospital with the intention of flying the length of our proposed route. Our eye in the sky was on its way. It was fully dark with no stars by the time we made the call, and shortly afterward we began to see red and white flashing lights moving westward in the sky ahead of us. The helicopter's pilot and I exchanged greetings as they tuned into our radio frequency, and I kept in touch with them as best as possible as we advanced along our route. What's more, it didn't take long before the co-pilot spotted something unusual just about a mile or so ahead of us. According to the helicopter's crew, they had spotted a person running along one of the mountain trails in the opposite direction we were heading. They had tracked the individual's movement for a moment or two, before losing sight of them around a set of standing stones. There were over 30 standing stones in the Beacons National Park. Some of them are many centuries old and reeved in myth. It isn't known exactly how many of the surviving standing stones are prehistoric. Some appear to be memorial stones, and others, well, they seem to have had more than one function, either as a boundary marker, waymark on ancient trails, signposts, or even rubbing stones for livestock. But whatever their purpose was, we had our next rendezvous point. One that we would have to reach quickly if we hoped to find our missing persons in good health. It took about 45 minutes of hard hill climbing before we reached the standing stones. They formed a high, rough circle, about 5 huge chunks of granite, worn and misshapen by the elements. According to the helicopter's crew, the person they had been tracking had run off the trail and into the standing stones before disappearing from view. It was more likely that the helicopter had simply let the person slip out of their searchlight and lost track of them. But why a person in peril would run away from the rescue chopper and not towards it was a complete and utter mystery to us. I mean, yeah, stranger things have happened on previous rescue attempts, but this little conundrum certainly left us scratching our head as we began to search for clues as to where the person might have headed to next. After a minute or two of combing the area, with only our personal torches for light, one of the many team members called over to me. Behind this standing stone, set into a little hillock that obscured from view, was a small opening in the earth. I say small, but it was just big enough for a fully grown adult to climb inside. And what was clear was that it was the perfect place for someone to hide in.
and it would be a perfect place to, get away from the biting wind and rain. I stuck my torch inside the opening and peered inside, only then just seeing how deep the passageway seemed to go. Wales used to be a hub for the British coal mining industry, and the country is now littered with disused mining pits and shafts, both ancient and modern. Knowing this full well, the underground passage didn't strike me as unusual at first, and I actually thought the missing hikers were lucky that they might have come across something like this to shelter them. I called out down the opening, checking to see if anyone had slipped down the tunnel and had gotten themselves stuck whilst trying to take a shelter or something like that. I received no reply. I then called over to one of the other team members, who had happened to carry the majority of our climbing ropes. We harnessed him up, staked climbing pegs into the earth just outside the entrance, and began to lower him into the opening to check for signs of life. We lowered him down so far into the earth that I began to worry about the prospect of getting him stuck. But thankfully, we didn't have to lower him any further before he found something. He called out for us to pull him up, alerting us that he had found an item of clothing that possibly belonged to one of our missing hikers. So we did just that. We pulled him back up, took the item of clothing from him, and lowered him back down to continue looking. As he did so, I took a quick look at the jumper he had brought up, and was struck by something unusual about it. It looked old. Really old. Clothing exposed to the elements for long periods can end up looking pretty rough, but not that rough. It appears as though it had been stuck down in that hole for far too long. We didn't find anything else down that hole, or the rest of the mountain. We stayed up there until about 3 in the morning, long after our helicopter support had to withdraw due to dwindling fuel. But we didn't find a single thing. No more clothes, no more signs of life, and no more bodies. The more it became clear that we weren't going to find anything, the more I thought about how the distress caller seemed convinced that the hikers were gone. She had no way of knowing that whatsoever, yet somehow she was right. And that really didn't sit right with me, at all. Throughout the next week, 2 more search parties took to the hills in hopes of finding a trace of our missing hikers. Both came back empty-handed. I expected reports of the missing hikers to appear in local news publications, only they didn't. When I tried to find out why, I was turned away by most police sources until one, slip, that a judge at the High Court of England and Wales had placed a publication ban on the incident, meaning an order prohibiting publication under Section 11 of the Contempt of Court Act in 1981 was in effect, keeping all news of the incident out of newspapers. But that's not what really bothers me about this whole thing. I mean, it's been confounding, sure, but it's another peculiar detail surrounding the case, and it keeps me up at night. The name stitched into the jumper we found down that hole in the earth was Robert Williams. I came to find out that this didn't match any of the names we had been given regarding to our missing hikers. In fact, Robert Williams had been missing from a nearby town of Neath since March of 2002. 17 years before our missing hikers were reported. Who was it that our helicopter support had spotted before they disappeared among the standing stones? Was it one of our missing hikers, or was it, in fact, the long-lost Robert Williams? Regardless, I can't help but think I find the answers to these questions at the bottom of that tunnel, hidden somewhere among those standing stones. Thanks for listening to these creepy and allegedly true middle-of-nowhere stories sent in by viewers just like you. If you enjoyed these stories, please be sure to hit that like button, as it helps me out a lot. If you're new to the swamp, why not join us? Hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications to never miss a new video. If you have a story that you would like to share and hear in a future video, be sure to submit that story at swampdweller.net or the email you can find in the description down below. I would absolutely love to share your story. It's stories like yours that help keep this show going. If you're not aware, you can download your favorite Swamp Dweller scary stories on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher Radio,
and every other place that you listen to podcasts. Thank you guys as always for supporting the swamp the way you do. It's very much appreciated. If you made it all the way to the end of this video, I have a question for you. What is your favorite genre of scary movie? Personally, I love psychological thrillers. I love a movie that makes me think. I'd love to know yours. I'll see you guys soon with another creepy video.